Hello again. So this week we'll be discussing what sources we can rely upon to understand clearly and easily the meaning of insight or emptiness. But before we start, let's just take a moment to reconsider our motivation, especially understanding the benefits of being a Buddha, being able to benefit all beings, being able to help relieve suffering, and to give non-fear, fearlessness, and to provide a path of practice and awareness to help people, individuals, be free from suffering. So with that in mind, we need to study and practice, and we need to learn, especially the 6 perfections, and of those, the only path to that guarantees enlightenment from a Buddhist perspective is that of understanding emptiness. Well, really, all of 4 Noble Truths, but there's a particular emphasis on emptiness, especially as this is what we, especially when it comes to our understanding of ourselves, how we are seeing ourselves as precious and easy to hurt, then we're prone to suffering, prone to grasping. Okay. So let's listen carefully and I'll do what I can, and we'll see what we can do to make some sense and to provide some information that will be useful to us in our understanding. So before I start, this is chapter 8 on relying on definitive sources. Again, I mentioned last week that there are different ways of being able to understand emptiness from the Buddhist practice, from the Buddhist point of view, for various different approaches. Several of them are quite philosophical, and they involve having to understand aspects or natures of the mind, and so on. And one of the aspects, or one of the methods, is known as the middle way teaching, or the Madhyamaka. And the Madhyamaka is different in the sense that it really primarily, while it does depend upon logic and understanding to help us there, it doesn't require us to accept a philosophy or some idea about the structure of the world. So it's very suitable for us, especially in the modern world, the Madhyamaka path. We'll still need to talk about some key points, some key areas of distinction and what they mean, just to be very clear in our minds about what we're really talking about. But I think we'll have no problem with that in general. I'll do my best anyway. So Rinpoche starts off by saying, since we've established that we need to have insight or wisdom, we must now learn how to train in it. And in order to do that, first of all, we have to understand what it is that we're training in. And then later on, we can examine that more closely and how to develop it in our meditation. So first of all, in order to establish what it is, then we need to listen to and also read a series of things that will help us to understand it. And that's why we're here today, I guess. So it says here to rely upon a scholar who accurately understands the key points and so on. And I cannot claim that I have this, but I think what he's really talking about are those people who who've written the text that we're using. And in this case, we're talking about Rinpoche himself. Having said that, I mean, I have some small understanding of this text, otherwise I wouldn't be attempting to share it with you. So it says, really, we need to allow ourselves to think about and study and learn what emptiness and means. And in order to do that, we need to actually do that in a way which leads to an experiential change in our lives. So we're not just talking about a philosophical debate or some sort of interesting idea. What we're really trying to do is to change who we are. And to do that, we need to have some experience with this. So he said in this sense, what we need to do is to, if we have developed this knowledge, this experiential knowledge of reality as it is in its ultimate or final nature, then we won't be, if in order to do that, we're going to need to understand a mechanism that will bring us there. So this is sort of a clarity of our mind. And so in order to get that clarity, we have to be able to eliminate certain presumptions that we might have or some convictions that we have. And we need to be very, very specifically clear about what they are and how they work or how they do not work. So it says in order to do this, and he's going to introduce two terms now, is that we need to work on those texts which are, especially the sutras that we have in Buddhist sutras and so on, both Mahayana and Theravada sutras, which are known as definitive. So definitive sutras rather than provisional sutras. And he's going to explain in a little bit what he means by provisional and definitive. And he says is that when we're looking at understanding wisdom, then we depend upon definitive sutras rather than provisional sutras. And he says, and it's therefore these the areas that we need to be concentrating on. And he says then, not only do we need to depend upon those sutras which are definitive, we also need to rely upon those texts and commentaries made by those scholars and yogis or Mahayanas, especially in the early Indian ones, who were very good at commenting accurately on Buddha's thought. It says without that, they were like a blind person headed towards some danger without any guide. So therefore, he says we've got to have these two things. We need to be aware of and recognize definitive sutras, and we also need to be aware of what commentators we can rely upon to help us. And he says, well, what sort of commentator should we depend upon? And he says, Rinpoche says, the one that we can definitely rely upon is the one that Buddha has predicted in many of the sutras, and also is recognized by almost every single school of thought, and is well known outside of even Buddhism itself. And his name is Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna is a very famous Indian writer of the 1st century. And many people have written commentaries on his key works, especially the Mula Madhyamika Karika. So this text is very, very pithy. It's very, very strong and very powerful. But it's, as I said last session, many people read this, and also the definitive sutras, the wisdom sutras. And when they do so, they it can be like a Rorschach ink blot for them. They actually project all their own ideas onto it, and then think, "Oh yes, I know this," and then interpret it. And this can cause all sorts of issues. So we have to be very, very clear how to even read Nagarjuna clearly, because otherwise we might make a mistake in terms of what he's really saying. And it's very easy to do that. There's an American scholar called Elizabeth Napper, who wrote in one of her translations of this text about how there are almost as many different variations or interpretations of Nagarjuna as there are Western philosophers and authors who've had a try at interpreting it. So yeah. So he says, in order to let's get this clear, we need to identify scriptures of provisional and definitive, so we know what is definitive. And then what we're going to do, he says, is it's a good idea to know who we can rely upon along with Nagarjuna, and then how then to use these texts to provide us with a clear determination of the meaning of the view of emptiness, or to understand emptiness precisely. So there are, well, okay, I'll just carry on reading because otherwise I'll get carried away. So what is a provisional sutra, and what is a definitive sutra? So when we're looking at sutras, the texts that were written, or that were said by Buddha, they're written down versions of what Buddha taught. Some of them are Mahayana sutras, particularly not recognized by the Theravadins, but in generally Mahayana recognizes all of the sources of the texts that are called sutra. And of those, there are many, many different ideas within them. And this is because Buddha taught according to the audience present. And if there were a particular audience, he would use language that was particularly useful for them. And an example, people who had been formerly fire worshippers, and he wanted to help them understand the nature of suffering. And so he gave the famous fire sermon, the Fire Sutra, to them, and they were able to relate very strongly. So this sort of thing is one of the skills that one has as a Buddha, is to be able to teach according to the audience. And what that means is that if we recognize who is in the audience, which is one of the aspects that we find in the sutras, then we have an idea about who this sutra is actually written for. So the Vinaya texts, those which are to do with monastic vows or the vows of the nuns, you'll see that the audiences for these were only the nuns or the monks, and not lay people. So these were specifically, these talks were given specifically for monks or nuns. And likewise, certain things for kings and so on are often given with lots of other people present, and so they're appropriate for lay people and so on. So he says, how do we identify what is definitive and what is provisional? And he says this really is to do with the way in which the subjects that these texts are discussing. He said, if they teach the ultimate, the final nature of reality, then they're said to be definitive. And if they teach conventionalities, then they're said to be provisional. So he has already introduced, and we'll have a lot of this, two words, ultimate and conventional, and they're going to be repeated a lot. So what is an ultimate teaching or an ultimate truth is what something is finally. When we look at something or we examine something, we might see it as a narrative or something, but if we really went through sort of like in depth to identify exactly what it is, then this would be its ultimate truth, the final truth, the truth that cannot be denied about it. So one of the aspects of this is in terms of its nature, if you like, or its nature, or of its nature of existence, or the way in which it exists, is going to be something that when you look at it, the closer you look at it, the more easy it is to see it. So this is one of the qualities of an ultimate truth, is the more and more you examine it, the easier it is to see. Whereas a definitive truth, it becomes more and more complex the more you see it, because you're having to think about it within the context within which it is being used. So, for example, in many ways, in looking at conventionalities, but there's two aspects here we're looking at, is ultimate and conventionalities. And conventionalities are things like Buddha and me and you and cameras and shrines and all these sorts of things, and clouds and aeroplanes. And these words we use, or these belong to a series of narratives that we fill them with. And those narratives are shared and common amongst us, and they provide us with conventions. So it's a bit like language, but not just language, also the ideas behind them. And so we can talk and share an idea about something like an aeroplane, and we both understand what an aeroplane is and what it does and how it works and so on. So this is important, because while we could say, well, therefore there is an aeroplane out there, it depends upon the context within which that idea arises. So, for instance, if we were looking at particle physics or elements, but chemistry, but let's look at particle physics, which are things like electrons and neutrons and protons, very, very small components that all atoms are made out of. Then if we're looking at some sort of under a microscope at these atoms, and somebody says, well, where's the aeroplane? Yeah? Well, there's no aeroplane there, because there is no aeroplane within the context of atoms or atomic structures. They're big, super, huge things in comparison. They don't make sense for us to talk about aeroplanes within atoms. When we go smaller than atoms, there are quarks. Or actually, before you can get to quarks, there are what are called particles, and they're like electrons and so on. And those are made of quarks, and according to modern physics, right? And then if we look down, we sort of say, well, where's the gold? There's no gold there, because gold is a much bigger object, just like the aeroplane's a bigger object in terms of elements. So in this sort of way, we can say that really we have to think about the context of a situation to understand the conventions that are used within it. So in that way, we can say that really, even if we're to look at these things, the way in which we see them tends not to be the way in which they really are. And that's a very strong sign that they belong to a conventionality, a convention. So everything that when we normally talk, or what we're talking with or about, are conventionalities. So then there's this definitive or this ultimate truth and the true nature of things. And this is to do with what we're having to learn and see it and experience it. So he says those sutras, he's actually quoting another sutra called the Yamati Sutra. Those sutras that teach so as to establish the final truth, the final way in which things are called definitive. And those that teach in terms of words or things or concepts are provisional. So those that do teach the profound reality, the deepest reality of which is it's very difficult to understand and difficult to know. It's a challenge to know. They're called definitive. So I said, the more you look at it, the clearer it becomes. But working out how to look at it and what it is we're looking at is not easy at all, because we're very, very able to and to try to put things into what it is we're looking. We need to really take everything away very carefully. So then the question arises, Rinpoche says, how does a sutra teach conventionalities to be classified as provisional, and how does a sutra teach the ultimate so as to be classified as definitive? And he says, well, this is also found in the Yamati Sutra. It says basically those that teach as though there was an owner when there really is none, or they use expressions such as the self, I, sentient being, living being, nourished being, creature, person, human agent, humanity, experiencer, experience. All of these belong to provisionality, or to the provisional, or to to convention. Whereas definitive sutras are those that teach the door to liberation, emptiness, and they talk about things in a negative context, normally, or in a negative linguistic sense. Emptiness, signlessness, wishlessness, no compensation, no production, no creation, no sentient beings, no living beings, no persons, and no owners. So this means that the definitive are those that teach selflessness and no production and so on, by eliminating any elaboration. So what he means by this is he says that elaborations, like sort of things that are prone to arise and fall, or to come into existence and then fade away, says these sorts of aspects are not talked about as within the scope of definitive sutras. So he says, but when we are, so therefore we need to understand that when it says no self, no production, no cessation, and so on, this is a sutra which is definitive. And when it says, there is production and there is cessation, and there are these things, then this is conventional. This is conventional. So he says, and then again he cites now the King of Concentration Sutra. He says, understand as instances of definitive those that teach in accordance with emptiness, as explained by the Buddha. So, and those provisional, all those teachings that talk about a sentient being, or a person, or a living being, or a Buddha. And again, Rinpoche cites Kamarshila on the important Indian commentator. So those things, and Kamarshila says, those things which are ultimate have a definitive meaning, and the others have a provisional meaning, and they are the ones that are conventional. So Rinpoche then says, so then there's a collection of the Madhyamaka and the middle way. Madhyamaka is just a Sanskrit for middle way. So the Madhyamaka are texts, and there's a core section of texts, mainly written by Nagarjuna here, but also by his first sort of major student. And so these here are going to be and their commentaries, and these are the commentaries by, so we've got Aryadeva, and then we've got also all the commentaries by people such as Chandrakirti and Buddhapalita and so on. So these are considered texts that precisely teach the definitive, because they demonstrate at length the meaning of the ultimate, and which is then free from all these elaborations such as production and cessation, arising and falling in this sense. So he says, why do we use these words, provisional or definitive? Why do we need to go there? And he says, well, primarily the point about it is that when we're looking at a text, it's harder a definitive text, it's harder for us to interpret it as meaning something else. It's very clearly about what it is being spoken about. And it's essentially it's trying to determine the end point of how we would consider something in terms of the meaning of being the way in which things really are. And one of the other things about this, and this is one of the qualities about emptiness and why it's so important in Buddhism, is that it's fairly easy to demonstrate the truth of it. It's not something that takes us that we would find hard to accept. But it does, in order to do that, we need to be clear about exactly what it is we're determining. So in this way, what we're saying is actually there are many things in Buddhism which are less hard for us to prove logically, to demonstrate completely. I mean, even the existence of a Buddha, enlightenment in terms of the qualities of a Buddha, So these sorts of things are very hard to actually prove or to demonstrate truthfully, just using logic or reason. But emptiness is actually, it's very easy to do that in comparison. So while I personally, I sort of feel that Rinpoche is making this point that actually it can't be interpreted as having a contrary meaning. Yes, it can. I mean, people do interpret it all sorts of different ways, and we find that why there are so many different Buddhist commentators who are considered to have made mistakes. But what he's saying is that if we are unable to understand it clearly, what is that's being said, then it's very easy for us to have to determine, yes, this is what this is about. So it's not like if we have a text, for instance, that's about the life of the Buddha, then there are many different ways in which we could interpret what the meaning or what the purpose of that text is about. In this case, it's not so hard. So he says, therefore, all the sutras that are provisional are those that are different from that, in that they require interpretation, or they can be read literally, but the literal meaning isn't one that establishes a final reality. So then, in this sense, if we want to understand it, in terms of reality, we need to look beyond where the text is discussing. So this is important. I want we need to express just how important this is. So we can say, for instance, there's a very, let's say, many lovely texts on karma, and karma is consequences of actions. Now, those texts being not about being on the final truth, they're about conventionalities. One might be led down the idea of saying, oh, well, in which case karma doesn't exist. And this would be a mistake. This would misunderstand the nature of convention is very, very correct. It's not wrong. For instance, a statement such as there are 3 cars in the street. If imagine that there are 3 cars in the street. This is actually establishes a truth. It doesn't establish a fiction, but it doesn't establish an ultimate truth. It doesn't really talk about the final nature of the cars. It just tells us a fact, which is something that we can rely upon. So in these sorts of ways, we have to understand that truth, conventional truth, or truth within a convention, completely valid and completely not to be rejected. So it's not as if when we say provisional or interpreted or whatever, he says we can accept these literally, we can understand them literally, but we have to understand within the context in which they're given. So like things like cars and so on belong to a normal way of looking at the world, and those things they're not therefore wrong in themselves. Within the context in which they're given. In fact, we need to depend upon conventionalities to understand anything. So this is really important for us. So then somebody's coming. So you have these sort of like students of his who are like, okay, well, you say this, but how about that? Or maybe our minds. So I think sometimes it's our minds say, okay, well, right, let's talk about this. So you're saying like, you're saying to me that Rinpoche, according to your definition, you're saying that a sutra that has a definitive meaning, it needs to be taken literally. And yet, when we read the sutra, it says there is no production, there is no humans, there is no enlightenment, there is no this, right? No form, and so on. And it says, then therefore, because these things arise in these sutras, we must conclude that these things don't exist, because you're saying we have to treat them literally. So he says, if we can't treat them literally, then according to you, we need to treat them provisionally. So Rinpoche's response is, okay, well, if we actually look at this, the argument at face value might seem very strong, but actually if we read enough sutras, find enough sutras, especially definitive sutras, which talk about no form, no feeling, no, and so on, then these ones here, there are many sutras where they actually say ultimately. So there's ultimately no form, there's ultimately no feeling, there's ultimately none of this or the other. And ultimately no production. So he says, then if we understand that Buddha uses this even just the once, as he says, ultimately this happens to the case, then we can use that instance of the one time in which he says this, and then generalize across this to understand that indeed, when he says no form, no feeling, he means ultimately there is no form, ultimately there is no feeling, ultimately meaning finally. Just the final truth of it is like this. And remember, this does not mean it doesn't have an effect, and this is important. So we need to look at that later on. And he said, anyway, if I was wrong, and if we assumed that these sutras did refute or refute production or refute all of these things, just as you imagine, we would have to take them literally in this sense. Then we would have all sorts of problems, such as the fact that there would be no words, there would be no scripture, there'd be no text, there'd be no sutras, and so they would defeat themselves. So he said, don't let's get carried away here. He says, even though there might be some phrases missing from a text, or also there might be parts of that sutra which are provisional, then what we need to do is to look at the body of the teaching and then the body of the text and see, is this a definitive or not? So, for instance, almost every sutra starts off with, thus I have heard at one time. Well, I have heard at one time is obviously a provisional statement according to what Rinpoche is saying here. So we need to be aware of the fact that, if Buddha is residing in a deer park or is giving meditating on Vulture Peak or whatever these things like that, then and then after that a question is asked and somebody answers, and these things are all provisional. But the answer, there is no form, there is no feeling. These things then are the definitive text, and that's what Rinpoche is saying here. So we need to be clear about what's being said here. And so he says that even if there's only a little bit of a few places within the text where this is the main subject, then that still means we need to accept it as being definitive because of those bits. And those bits are the bits which are definitive. And likewise, there are plenty of provisional texts which we must take literally, but while they don't, because they tell us important things, but if they don't go into the area of explaining the nature of reality, then they're still considered to be provisional. So that's how we distinguish between provisional and definitive. So then Rinpoche moves on to talk about a little bit about the commentary, a history on the commentary of Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna, I think, was around 1st century Common Era, so around 180 or so. And he gave very, very insightful and interesting, provocative, but very, very interesting insight into the meaning of the Perfection of Wisdom sutras. So if we read the sutras, a lot of what they say is there is not this, there is not that, there is not this, there is not that. And it seems very much like a paradox, because you have somebody says, And then he walked across, and then it was like, well, there are no persons. So there's this sort of this paradox between whether or not things are or they're not. And Nagarjuna actually helped to begin to unpick what was really being said, what was meant by Buddha's middle way or teaching on wisdom. And his main student, I think, who's 2nd century, is Aryadeva. So these two here, everybody who follows the middle way understanding of emptiness, or the path to emptiness through the middle way, the Madhyamaka. Madhyamika means they are the person. Madhyamaka is the path. So those people who follow the Madhyamaka, the middle way, all depend upon these two. So nobody, without any issue at all, rejects either Nagarjuna or Aryadeva from the Madhyamaka school. So if you're Madhyamaka, then you accept this. Now these were very early on, and they sort of their ideas caught like wildfire across the whole of North India, and they were propagated to China very, very early on, which took on the Chinese Asian Madhyamaka traditions, which were very, very informative in many ways. However, the Chinese didn't wait around in that sense for people like Chandrakirti and Buddhapalita. So some of the nuances of these texts were lost on them, even though they were introduced by Nagarjuna and so on. Some of the nuances of the meaning of the sutra could be lost. And there was, for certainly some schools, there was a tendency to feel that there was a sort of no direct way of being able to actually understand the meaning without a personal introduction from a teacher. So there's and also there's some influence maybe or from like possibly a Taoism of sort of saying this is a paradox which we need to work on, an impossible paradox we have to resolve. Now, in many ways, when we come to the later commentators, Buddhapalita, Bhavaviveka, Chandrakirti, and Shatarakshita, these primarily help to begin to explain further yet the underlying meanings of Nagarjuna and Aryadeva, who themselves were explaining the meanings of the Heart Sutra and the other similar definitive sutras. So what that means is essentially that especially by the time we get to understanding from Chandrakirti, it is the means by which one understands emptiness, the reasoning by which one is led to understand emptiness, is complete. There's a full journey of how we're able to do that. And we have to keep our mind sharp, but we can do that. So then there's Rinpoche spends a paragraph or two talking about some various different distinctions that were earlier made about the different ways in which people understood the development of the Madhyamaka, both in India and also in Tibet. Why I'm slightly resistant to going into it is because it introduces a lot of apparent distinctions based upon apparent forms of what seem to be very strongly philosophical points. And I don't think it's very useful for us in terms of us understanding emptiness. However, and Rinpoche says what he wants to do is to establish only the systems of the great Madhyamakas, or Madhyamikas rather, who followed Nagarjuna. He says there are all sorts of subtle distinctions we can make about all sorts of different ways in which people see them, but it doesn't necessarily seem to resolve or solve our issue, which is we need to have this experience. and we're not here to be sort of historians. What we're really wanting to do is to make sure that we can trust who we can trust in terms of making sure that we can understand these things. So then, in terms of the history of Nagarjuna's thought, there's a Tibetan called Yeshide who said that there are certain aspects about sort of some basic conventionalities and basic truths in Nagarjuna and Aryadeva, which were not necessarily made very clear in their treatises, such as, for instance, whether external objects exist. So in Buddhism, the word external, internal doesn't mean outside the house or, subject to the wind. External means outside of the mind, and internal means within the mind. So when we talk about external objects, we're talking about those things that are external to our mind, like this cup. Does it exist conventionally? In other words, do we talk about it? And if it does exist conventionally, does it do it outside of the mind, or is it merely a mental construct? So the one of the first teachers, I think 6th or 7th century, Baba Viveka, he demonstrated that those scholars who considered that external objects did not exist conventionally, in other words, they didn't exist at all, either conventionally or ultimately beyond the mind. Like somebody called Vinyapti Patra and Baba Viveka demonstrated, in fact, this cannot be the case. However, then there was Shantarakshita, who sort of taught a middle way, Madhyamaka, that was hybrid with the Yogacarya, the mind-only school. The mind-only school has a very strong emphasis on the mind. And in his idea, he said, is that basically we can't really talk about the conventional existence of external objects. But unlike Yogacarya, within Shantarakshita also said that the mind ultimately lacks any intrinsic or self-nature. So he said, therefore, we have these two, one called Sautrantika Madhyamaka and the latter Yogacarya Madhyamaka. And this means basically one which is sort of in the simple way, things exist externally, middle way, and things which mind only, middle way, like that. So the problem about this is to say that actually, if we move further on from Baba Viveka and Shantarakshita, and we look at somebody like Chandrakirti, who was alive teaching about 300, 400 years prior to when this text was written, it was the 9th century or 8th century, then he wasn't a Sautrantika. So the way in which he talked about things wasn't like that either. So therefore, it's not right to call him a sort of Sautrantika like this. So then later on, this is all very early on in terms of Buddhism within Tibet, so 7th century, 8th century, 9th century. Then later on, sort of 10th, 11th, 12th century, then the ideas of Prasangika and Svatantrika came. So these were the two different types of Madhyamika now that everybody more or less accepted as, and since then, so since for the last 1,000 years or so, there's basically these two ideas, the Prasangika and the Svatantrika. And Chandrakirti himself, in his text, the Prasnapada rather, sort of indicates this distinction. He doesn't use the terms. The terms, I think, are Tibetan, but he does. Although they got Indian, they were more strongly adopted by Tibetans. But the way in which he talks about this is definitely that right. And this was to do with this discussion between these scholars themselves, between the way in which such things are taught. So he says there are two ways in which we can talk about Madhyamakas, therefore, those within those who do or do not assert external objects in conventional terms, but primarily how we develop in the mind stream the certainty of emptiness. If we think about that in terms of how we develop it, then there are these two types, the Prasangika and the Svatantrika. So the Prasangika and the Prasangika and the Svatantrika, these two words mean that they are Sanskrit words, and a prasanga is a consequence, is like a consequence, but a logical consequence or a rational consequence, and it's sort of like absurdity. So primarily, what it does is there's a Latin phrase known as reductio ad absurdum, which is where it's an argument used in the West, in mathematics and in philosophy and in logic, which is where you're able to demonstrate the absurdity of a position, and because it is absurd, it cannot be that way. So it asserts, it helps to demonstrate something other than the absurdity. So the Prasangikas tend to use this form of the reductio argument in terms of being able to convey meaning, whereas the Svatantrika, the idea is that there's a common ground in terms of the way in which we discuss things, and it's through this common ground that we're able to demonstrate an understanding. So both of these are really very subtle in terms of the difference. It's not as if the Svatantrika do not use prasanga or consequences or reductios. They do that, but the problem really is a subtle one. I think that Rinpoche deals with it much later on, and seems to be very, very small. But the idea is to say is the way in which I perceive something and the way in which you might perceive something is might appear to be the same. So we can both say, oh yeah, this is a cup, but what is it that makes it a cup? What is it that somehow makes it a cup? And Vasubandhu's argument was that, well, there's some characteristics that determine what a cup is that we both agree upon. So one of the aspects of that is to say that therefore it implies that what you're saying is that the cup has some characteristics, it has a qualities attached to it that make it a cup. And the problem that we have with that is that while, even if I understand emptiness, if I'm trying to teach to somebody who doesn't understand emptiness, there's no common ground, because they will see the characteristics as being inherent or belonging to the cup. And in that sense, we have a problem, which is that there's no ability for me to be able to use this language in a way which demonstrates that absence. Whereas absurdity does not depend upon us having a common ground at all. All I need to do is to demonstrate to you that the way in which you see this cup is absurd. right? And that leads you to saying, okay, well, if it isn't like that, how about this? And then we say, no, that's absurd too. And eventually one comes to a point where one understands that the very way in which we presume a cup to exist cannot exist in that particular way. So this is the prasanga, this is the absurdity argument, where we do not need to share a common ground. I, as a teacher or as the person who's trying to convey our understanding, need to have some idea about how you may be considering it. But when we talk about I and you, we're really talking about our own minds. So we're working on developing these for ourselves. But it's like that. So these very, very subtle differences. It's not as if we're talking about huge differences of opinion, but the way in which we are using language that has a possible sort of very, very slight touch of something being actually there on its side independently is recognized as being dangerous when we're talking about understanding precisely what the meaning of emptiness is. So Rinpoche then says, of all the various different masters that we can rely upon, who made commentaries on, or who were renowned for their commentaries on Nagarjuna and Aryadeva, Atisha, the person who was also responsible for providing the text that the Lamrim is based upon, an Indian man from Bengal. His idea, his perception was that Chandrakirti is primarily the best option, the best person to choose for. He's very, very, very clear, very precise, and very able in his explanations. And therefore, the teachers of the past who followed Atisha tended to do this. Who followed the teacher tended to use Chandrakirti, and that would include Lama Tsong-kapa. So Je Rinpoche says, therefore, most of my teachers followed Atisha, and therefore I'm most familiar with Chandrakirti. Whereas Chandrakirti, in his own texts, so his Indian as meditator of the 9th century or 8th century, he felt he also then said Buddha Palita we can rely upon very strongly. So Buddha Palita was a prior meditator. And therefore what we have are these four primary teachers, commentators, Indian commentators, as well as the sutras. Nagarjuna and his primary student Aryadeva, and then Buddha Palita, and then Chandrakirti. So these four. And these four scholars basically who we can rely upon in order to be able to pierce through our ignorance and to understand emptiness. Now, it doesn't mean that they are the sole torchbearers of the truth. As I said, what they're going to do, or what is going to happen in the next quite a few sessions, is that we're going to be using these four meditators, as well as Rinpoche's own commentary on this, to provide us with a path that leads to an understanding of emptiness that we can rely upon. Now, if we were to say, well, what about all the other teachers with that? There are systems which provide us with the same ability to understand emptiness. So the point about this is that we are not establishing the presence of something. We're establishing the absence of something. So if we were establishing the presence of something, it would be very important for us to recognize what that thing was, or those things were. But what we're actually trying to do is to remove something. We're taking something away from the way in which we see the world. And that thing that we're trying to take away is this idea that things independently exist on their side. So in that sense, what we need to do is to find a way of understanding what that really means, not just conceptually, but to experientially, what it means to say something doesn't exist on its own side, without it sort of vanishing. Yeah. So it's no use for us to sort of say, oh, things don't really exist, because if we do that, we fall into a terrible pit, which is why other systems such as the Yogacarya came into existence. They were so wary of people just saying, oh, well, therefore it doesn't exist, that they introduced things like mind only, which Asanga, who we've been talking huge amounts from Asanga over the last few months, was a Yogacaryan. So mind only school. So mind only, so it prevented us from, or prevents us from falling into a mistake of thinking that because things don't exist on their side, therefore they don't exist at all. And this is absolutely wrong. This is a complete mistake. There's one that's made a comment by many Western scholars when reading the Nagarjuna. So, and in Buddhism, this is known as nihilism, or falling into a nothingism. And many Indian philosophers felt that, and Nagarjuna was teaching a nihilistic path, and he was not. So we have to establish the truth of the existence of the cup, without, at the same time, by recognizing that it exists, but it doesn't exist on its own side, and that's what we're going to be talking about, and why that's important. Obviously, otherwise it's just intellectual. There's no value to that. So we don't want to spend a vast amount of our time going to be sort of just doing philosophy for philosophy's sake. We're not interested in philosophy. We're interested in helping beings escape from suffering. And that's really important for us. So essentially what's not important is some sort of intellectual game. This isn't about really philosophy. This isn't about intellectuals. This is about actually changing the way in which we perceive things, changing the way in which we experience things. And once we understand this absence, then just from the sheer power of understanding it, we become a little bit more loose. We get a bit more free in terms of the way in which we respond to or identify with issues. So, for example, if somebody insults somebody who, insults somebody who's got no experience with this, and they're like, how dare they, insult me, this outrageous behavior, completely, infuriating, and feel really very hurt by it, and so on. But if there's somebody who's actually understood emptiness correctly, that doesn't arise so strongly. It can still arise because we're foolish and filled with all sorts of ideas, but it's going to be completely mitigated by recognizing that actually this who dares to do that to me, that it is really much more of a much less real than it appears to be. Yeah. So, because it's the part of it that's less real is this clinging, desperately clinging onto this sense of self, and that clinging is because we have this fear that there's this sort of half fear, I think, that one needs to struggle to sustain this sense of self all the time. And then this is based upon a sort of a strong ignorance. So for the time being, though, the question is, I think, that the chapter's finished with this session, but for the time being, I think it's very good for us to recognize two aspects which I've mentioned before are going to be very, very instrumental in understanding or helping us to get to understand emptiness. So if we have some time before next session, to give them to really start thinking a lot about the meaning of impermanence, how everything is completely changing from moment to moment. Every single atom that is even anything above absolute freezing, which is every atom in there is in movement, is not still. So everything is moving, and therefore everything is changing. That energy is always there. It's always causing a change. So that's one thing, and that understanding impermanence, this subtle change that everything is very slowly changing, is very, very important for us. And secondly, to understand how there are consequences to actions. So specific, especially in actions that we do as individuals, as people, but in many other ways, just in terms of the way in which consequences follow through and cause more consequences in great waves across the world. This is very, very important to understand. So these two things, consequences and impermanence, are very, very useful bases for us to be able to be very, very clear about emptiness. If we don't understand or we don't recognize impermanence, or if we don't recognize or don't understand the pervation of consequences of actions, then it's going to be very hard for us to understand emptiness. Okay, so our quote today. So first of all, let's just dedicate any benefit from this to setting our minds to continue to understand the Dharma and the path to enlightenment, to continue to commit ourselves to the path to enlightenment, recognizing that this is the best way or the strongest way for us to actually make a difference in the world. And then also to consider how we ourselves have a duty of care to all sentient beings. We have this opportunity in this human body to not to put it to waste. And so because we don't want to put it to waste, we need to consider how we may use this to benefit all beings. Okay, so that's what we're doing. This is why we're here. This is our purpose. And may we continue to do that. So let's finish with a meditation on, well, any you choose, but impermanence is good, or consequences, causality, or just samatha.